Welcome, listener. You're tuned into the ghostly broadcast, Paranormal Station. I am your host, Timothy, broadcasting from my farm, where the eternal world of spirits interjects with our mortal coil. Across the globe, humanity has honored and revered our dead in myriad ways. From the highest pharaohs of Egypt to the common peasant serf buried in a catacomb of plague victims. We enact upon the spirit world via our actions with the remains left behind. In these testimonies, we're traveling to Europe to share in the customs of appeasing the souls of the departed. And what can happen when our established ceremonies don't go to plan? Our first story. Dear Timothy, I'm Marinette. I come from a family of old money up in northern France. We're pretty spread out. My parents and I could reasonably be called upper middle class, but some of our extended family are incredibly wealthy. Richest of all was my grandmother. When my grandfather died, she was left with the entire estate. All of his businesses, investments, and a large chunk of land that is dotted with cideries. Needless to say, she was pretty well off. I only ever have good memories of my grandparents. While they were graced with incredible wealth, they maintained their life on their chateau, unperturbed by anything else. I loved visiting them when I was a child. I was heartbroken when she died. I was studying in London, but flew back home for the funeral. Before I left, I'd been up to visit her. Although frailer and grayer, she was still active and on her feet. I think we both meant it when we said we'd see each other in a few months. It's why I was so shocked when it happened. By the time I'd arrived home, the funeral was being arranged. The rest of the family had already descended, and her estate was parceled off with barely a word of protest. I'd missed the reading of her will, but I was told that she had left the chateau of my childhood memories to me. My dad broke the news to me that my uncle had decided that that would not happen and had already arranged for it to be liquidated and sold. In truth, we all expected this. It didn't matter to me. I was simply heartbroken that I hadn't been there to say goodbye. The funeral came in a blur, and we were received at the old chateau after the burial. I did my best to choke down the tears as I took one last look at the pictures hung on the wall, all of happier family times. My uncles, aunts, and cousins alike were all jovial, enjoying the cider and laughing over how long they'd been waiting for the old cow to pass so they could get a piece of the pie. It made me furious. I left for the garden to get some air, but the light shut off before I could. A cold chill blew through the air, and I swear I could smell my grandmother. That same perfume that she wore filled the air. "Vultures!" I heard her wail. "Vultures! All of you, get out! Get out! Get out! Get out!" My family started to scream and panic. My parents clutched each other, but I was the only one who wasn't scared. It's funny now, but I felt relieved to hear her voice. My relief was short-lived, however. I had never heard my grandmother raise her voice in anger, but to hear her disembodied voice crying out in anguish at her own kin. It hurt me to hear it. Someone yelled out, "Fire!" and smoke filled the air. My dad grabbed me and we filed out of the front door. Just in time to stand and watch as all the good memories I had left of her burned to ash and all the money my uncle had hoped to get with it. I don't blame my grandmother for being angry in death. What her own son did to her legacy was cruel and selfish. We don't associate with most of our extended family anymore. My biggest regret from all of this was that I wasn't there to be by her side in the end. Maybe I could have calmed her spirit, or perhaps this was predestined to happen. Either way, I hope your listeners can cherish the ones they love while they're still here, and let them leave this earth in peace when it's their time to go. Yours, Marinette. Thank you for your testimony, Marinette. When we lose our loved ones, we remember their lives fondly and honor their last wishes to the best of our ability. It is up to those left behind to carry on the legacies they leave us. Our next story comes from the front line of Ukraine, so listeners of delicate sensibilities be warned. Dear Timothy, my name is Pavlo, and I have been back and forth from the front line of Ukraine since the invaders came years ago, in 2014. I don't need to remind your listeners of what they already know. War has reached Europe once again, and soldiers are dying on the front each and every day. No one prepares you or even thinks about what happens to the dead in war. In truth, it is a grim task done by rough, numb people. Eventually, I suppose you get used to it. I've been getting on in my years. I'm no longer the man I used to be. My back, knees, and shoulder cannot take the strain that a younger man could, so I found myself employed with the thankless task of body detail. In an ideal world, countries at war are meant to make every effort to catalog and return the dead. But Russia isn't at war, right? They are at a special military operation while we fight for our lives. I don't mean to bring politics into this. Still, it seems that Putin is making every single Ukrainian soldier's job harder, even ours. Many of the Russian dead do not have any identifying documents, dog tags, or effects. We don't know who they are or who to return them to. All this culminated in a night that broke my spirit. We were conducting another body exchange. A few hundred of theirs for a few hundred of ours. We loaded up our trucks and made our way to an undisclosed location where the exchange was due to take place. We arrived first and offloaded the stiffs. They arrived shortly after and began loading our dead from their trucks to ours. We all just silently went about our macabre business. After our trucks were loaded, they started to get back in their trucks and made to leave. "What are you doing? Your dead are still here," I asked. "They don't want them," came the voice of the junior sergeant, referring to his commanders. Before I could protest, they had mounted up and were gone, leaving their dead comrades behind. With our trucks full and no space for them, we did the only decent thing we could do. I grabbed a shovel and started to dig. It took us the rest of the night to get the last of them into one big mass grave. We marked the location, mounted up, and headed home. As the light of dawn started to break through the canopy of trees, I saw a crowd of tattered men in the rearview twilight. Aimless, listless, hopeless. Abandoned men left by their country to die on a front, now stood abandoned even in death. I stopped the truck and turned my head out of the window. The ghostly figures couldn't see me. They couldn't even see each other. Each man was alone, standing in a forgotten corner of no man's land. I wasn't even shocked anymore. The sight broke my spirit, but I wasn't surprised. My co-driver shrugged me and snapped me out of it. I put the truck in gear and drove on. I watched from my rearview wing mirror as the men turned to see our trucks leaving. I hope this conflict is over soon, but I'm too old, bitter, and cynical to expect that. While I wasn't shocked at seeing a company of ghosts, every single one of those ghosts was shocked. I could see it in their faces. It was as if they had died twice and would never know peace. Be grateful for peace, Timothy. It is easily taken for granted. Yours, Pavlo. Thank you, Pavlo, for that honest and harrowing testimony. The horrors of war we inflict on one another are always bound to ring out shockwaves through the spirit world. The next sender is from Latvia and has stressed that there may be some sensitive subject matter. especially for abuse victims. Dear Timothy, because my actions broke the law in my country, I'm using a false name, so please call me Ingrida. I want to start by saying that my father was not a good man. The things that he did to me and my sister haunt me to this day. After he died, I rejoiced. I was so happy to finally be rid of the man that I looked forward to his funeral. He was not well liked, even among people who could be considered his peers. The funeral was a short and empty affair. Although my sister couldn't bear the thought of confronting him, I knew I had to go to make sure he was dead and gone. To see him put down into the earth for good, where he could never hurt little girls again. I knew we weren't his only victims, and I made sure for their sake that he was gone. But they say that no one is ever truly gone. We often say that for the loved ones we cherish when they pass, but we forget that it applies to the hated ones we'd rather see rotting in hell. A few weeks later, I started seeing him in my dreams again. I was 12 all over again. I was paralyzed with fear, stuck in my bed as that wretched man had his way with me, all while wearing that cursed, wicked smile. Those were the nightmares I'd spent years pushing down, but they had all returned to the surface. But they were just nightmares. After that, he started to come back into my waking world. It started with being paralyzed in bed while he stood in my doorway. Every night, he would edge closer and closer, standing rock still when I watched him, but inching closer when I wasn't. Then I started to see him in my waking hours, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a whiff of his cologne. Sometimes he'd be there in the mirror. He haunted my every step. I was done being afraid of him. He was dead, and I wasn't. I was going to keep it that way. I set off to the Old Believers' Church in the dead of night with a shovel and a can of gas in my car. I dug well into the night and cracked open his coffin. Even through his ugly, decaying flesh, I could still see that tight, evil grin on his face. It was the same look of satisfaction he would give me and my sister. When he had taken everything he wanted, we could do nothing to get it back, and he loved to relish that. Well, not anymore. I doused him in gasoline, stepped out of the grave, and lit him on fire. I stood over the crackling flesh and smoked a cigarette while he burned. I didn't see him, but I felt him screaming. I felt it hurt him, as he was banished into the ashes and carried on the wind to oblivion. That night, I slept a sound and deep sleep of relief, and I have never been haunted by him again. For you, Timothy, and your listeners, heed my advice. If you want to rid yourselves of the demons in your lives, burn them. Burn them all to ash. Yours, Ingrida. Thank you for your testimony, Ingrida, and I am glad you have found peace for you and your sister. Despite its destructive nature, fire also cleanses. Its flames lick away the past and leave a phoenix to rise in the ashes. Our next testimony comes from Germany. Dear Timothy, my name is Carl. I work at a funeral home in Koblenz. It's a beautiful city that sits on the banks of the Rhine. Obviously, my job is not the most desirable, but I take great pride and comfort in my work. It does come with some weighty burdens, however, especially when trying to bring comfort to the bereaved. One of the worst times I can recall is why I'm writing to you. I cannot imagine the anguish that parents must feel when burying their children. What's worse is when they haven't even got a body to bury. Years ago, a couple were struck with a horrendous tragedy when their young daughter drowned in the Rhine. They'd watched her get taken by the currents before succumbing to the water. They searched and searched, but they never recovered her body. It fell to me and my colleagues to organize and deliver a respectful, solemn funeral for the poor girl. I have always remained professional and respectful, but this one hit me particularly hard of all the funerals I have put together. A distraught family presided over a tiny coffin that we all knew was empty. A few days after the funeral, I was walking home through town with the river to my side. It was cold and dark, but what I saw was unmistakable. In the pale, clouded moonlight was the little lost girl we'd laid to rest, standing on the water in the middle of the river. I shook my head, dismissed it, and carried on walking home. A few weeks pass, and I'm walking my regular route home by the river. This time, I catch a glimpse of something down on the water. The little girl was there again, only this time her mother stood by her side holding her hand. It seemed that tragedy had once again stuck this poor young family. The news broke the next day when we received a body to prepare for burial. It was the girl's mother. The funeral went about as well as expected. The bereaved were distraught by the quick series of world-shattering tragedies, but the look in the father's eyes was one I can't forget. When all was said and done, the funeral home closed for the night. I was beside myself with a heavy heart. I made my way home, slowly through town. I stepped out onto the Baldwin Bridge and looked out onto the river. The peaceful, calm water glistened with twinkling little waves of reflected moonlight. I closed my eyes and sighed, breathing the weight on my chest to calm my soul. When I opened my eyes, I looked down and saw them standing on the water once more. The little girl, her mother, and now her father. I shed a tear for the three of them as they stood with their backs to me, gazing at the city from their watery grave. There are times when I still see them out there. I am not religious, believe it or not, but I have always felt that we all have somewhere to go when we leave this mortal plane. It comes as part of my job. If the three of them have found their place in the currents of the Rhine, I can only hope that they abide in peace as a family. Yours, Carl. Thank you for your testimony, Carl. Wherever our spirits go when we depart, we can only hope to be with the ones we love in the end. I want to thank our contributors for their testimonies. Dealing with death is a difficult thing to do. If you enjoyed this, dear listener, and would like to tune in to more of our ghostly broadcasts, consider a like and subscribe. You can hit the bell icon to hear all our latest broadcasts as they are released. Together, we shall delve deep into the abnormal, supernatural world that exists in the corner of our eyes, but just beyond our reach. I've been your host, Timothy. Good night.